Hi guys, I hope you're doing well, and in this video we're going to be discussing about the evaluation of the policies that we've already discussed before in order to reduce the current account deficit. So we'll study the evaluation and let's straight jump into the video. So guys, the first evaluation that I've written is the cause of the current account deficit. Now you know that a current account deficit is a problem, hence we implement the policies. Now we're going to be evaluating those policies to what extent they are successful, right? Now to what extent those policies would be successful will depend upon the cause of the deficit, that is the underlying cause of that deficit. What is the reason why that deficit is arising? Is it because of is it because of poor investments? Is it because of inflation? Is it because of low productivity? Or is it because that we have been importing a lot because of high incomes? Now that is, we have to identify the core reason of the deficit, because if we don't know the core reason or the underlying cause of the current account deficit, we will not be able to implement the correct policy, right? Because supply side policies to correct a deficit would be implemented for maybe structural reasons. If the deficit is due to poor productivity, lack of investment, high inflation, and expenditure reducing policies might be implemented to reduce a deficit, maybe because there has been high incomes in the economy, high aggregate demand, which has resulted into a rise in your sucking in of imports, right? More imports coming in the economy. So guys, we need to identify the cause of the deficit. So so that the government can actually target the policies according to the whatever the cause of that deficit is, right? So that we identify the underlying problem. So you need to understand that, for example, the government has implemented, let's say, expenditure reducing policies in order to reduce the current account deficit, to reduce AD, so that less imports are being imported, right? To reduce the import expenditures. You need to understand that these policies, guys, the expenditure dampening policies will only be successful if there is excessive import expenditure due to high incomes. Because if the current account deficit is not caused due to excessive import expenditure due to high incomes, then implementing expenditure reducing policies will not work, and it would represent a government failure, right? The government has failed to reduce the current account deficit, and those policies would be wasted, right? Because if, let's say, it has not been caused due to excessive import expenditure, and instead the deficit has been caused due to structural issues, right? Instead it has been caused due to structural issues. And what are structural issues? Such as lack of productive, there's low productivity, right? Low productivity. You can say there's high inflation, or you can say that there's poor investments. Now these are long-term structural issues. If you don't solve these issues, your exports will always remain uncompetitive, and then your current account will be in a deficit, or the deficit will worsen, right? So if the deficit is caused due to structural issues, then expenditure reducing policies will not work, right? We need to focus on long-term supply side policies to provide for that work for long-term solutions to this structural issues, right? And if you and as a consequence of that, what is going to happen is that if you implement the wrong policies, and if those policies are not targeting the cause of the deficit, hence the problem of the deficit will never be solved, right? And in fact, it would start conflicting with the various other macroeconomic objectives. Why? Because if you implement, let's say, expenditure reducing policies, your objective would be to reduce aggregate demand so that your real GDP and your national income falls. And when this would fall, you would import less, right? Because your incomes are falling. So what is going to happen is that if you implement expenditure reducing policies to actually reduce the imports via a reduction in your aggregate demand, this would have a recessionary impact, right? And it would result into demand deficit unemployment, or you can say it would result into cyclical unemployment. And the extent of the expenditure reducing policies, the extent of these policies would actually determine that to what extent the recessionary effect will be. So for instance, if you implement huge for instance, if you implement a huge expenditure reducing policies, right, and that might result into a significant fall in your aggregate demand, right, which may result into a significant decline in AD, causing a huge negative multiplier effect. For example, if this is full employment, and your national income would fall to Y1, so there would be a negative multiplier effect involved, and and basically this would quite be would result into a recessionary impact, right? So kind of what I'm trying to say over here is that knowing the objective is very knowing the cause of the current account deficit is very important. And you know what's going to happen is, if you try to, and even if for instance your deficit is caused due to structural reasons, because of your exports being uncompetitive, and instead of focusing on your exports through long-term supply side policies, you're actually trying to reduce imports through implementing, let's say, protectionism and tariffs. So that would worsen your international relations with your trading partners as well. So these are the problems that may arise, and this is one evaluation, a very good evaluation of policies that you can give, which will render the policies ineffective, right? So the second one is that we need to also see, or what is the size of the deficit, right? So if we are saying that we are implementing policies to reduce the current account deficits, we need to see the size of the deficit. We need to see what is the deficit, how much is the deficit, right? So not every deficit is a big problem because of a small deficit. So what is the size of the deficit? That is the current account, deficit, really a problem? Is it really an issue for the government to be worried about? And should the government really be concerned about intervening and implementing your expenditure switching or dampening or supply side policies? So the government has to consider this as well. What is the size that? What is the size of the deficit? So if the deficit is small, if the small deficit will not be difficult to finance. Now, before I proceed with the second evaluation, I want to explain you one thing, that if the current account is in a deficit. Now, we are not going into the detail that whether the deficit is a small deficit or a large deficit. Right now, we're saying if the deficit is a deficit. So if we have a current account deficit, then this deficit has to be financed, and it is financed through a financial account surplus. Now, financial account is another important component of BOP, which measures the financial investment being made in the country, inflows and outflows, right? It measures the hot money inflows, the foreign direct investment, portfolio investment, right? So so it has to be financed through a surplus on the financial account. Now, in order to create a surplus on the financial account, what the government will do is that it is going to basically issue external debt. It is basically going to issue debt. And how does the government issues debt? The government will basically increase the interest rates. Guys, if the government increases the interest rates, that would attract foreign investors, because they would invest money in the form of hot money inflows. So they would invest money, there would be short term flows of money in the country, in the banks, and in order to attract a higher, because that would give them, the foreign investors, a higher rate of return. So there would be inflow of financial capital, hot money inflows, and because the relative interest rates are higher. So what is going to happen is that it would result into a financial account surplus. But you need to understand that whatever the hot money inflows that are coming in the country, that's also debt, that's external debt, because the government has to repay back that money. And the problem with issuing external debt is that it may culminate into a currency crisis. Now, what's a currency crisis? Now, I'll tell you the situation, that a currency crisis usually arises when there's excessive borrowing that takes place in order to finance a current account deficit through a financial account surplus. Now, what will happen is that this will culminate into a currency crisis in the long term. And why is that? The reason is that if you're borrowing, if there's external debt that you're taking in, so what will happen is that, and if this continues, if the external debt actually continues over the long term, so your investors will also lose confidence in the economy, because they will lose confidence in the ability of the country to actually pay back these debts. And what will happen is that ultimately the foreign investors would be like, we don't want to buy any more debt. That is, we don't want to invest in your country. We don't want to do any further hot money inflows in your country. And in fact, whatever the hot money inflows that they have done, they would actually move that money out of the country, so it would result into hot money outflows. And why would they do that? It would result because they are now worried about the country's ability to pay back these debts, because the country has actually issued a lot of external debt. And as a result of that, what is going to happen is that it would increase the supply of the domestic currency, since when they would move their money out of the country into some other country, it would increase the supply of domestic currency. And increasing the supply of domestic currency, we know that how exchange rate works. It would depreciate the currency, it would weaken the currency, right? And the problem with this is that this is not only going to panic the foreign investors, it is also going to panic the domestic people or the local people, the domestic or the local people. So guys, please pardon my writing. I hope you're able to understand, since I'm also speaking, so I think you can relate. So it would also weaken the, it would also panic the domestic and the local people. Why? Because they will be like, why are these foreign investors suddenly taking their money out of the country, which means that something is wrong. And it's in the air. The panic is in the air. So the domestic people or the domestic investors would also withdraw their, would withdraw their savings and deposits, and they would start seeking better returns elsewhere, because they are also concerned about the economy's ability to repay, to generate or give them higher returns. And again, this will further increase the supply of the currency. And the problem is that, ordinary citizens are also moving their money to safer locations, right? And this would result into a mass capital flight. So the financial capital is now flying out of the country. There's a mass capital flight in the economy. So there's a ripple effect being created, because that mass capital flight is actually culminating into a currency crisis. Now that's a problem. It culminates into a currency crisis where your currency just keeps on going down, and then, it also results into a widespread economic crisis as well, because, um, what will happen is that it would create huge panic in the economy. And basically, it's you can say that this is the worst consequence. It is one of the worst consequences which no economy would want. The worst consequences of, number one, the large, very good words to use in evaluations. Number one, the large, it's the worst consequences of large, persistent deficits, plus large, persistent, and borrowing financed. Large, persistent, plus borrowing financed current account deficit. So perfect. So this is the problem. This is what a current account deficit may lead into. It may lead Large deficits may lead into, currency crisis. Now, coming back to the second evaluation, I was saying that the size of the deficit actually matters a lot. But the problem is that, if the deficit is very large, then obviously, what is going to happen is that it is going to be financed through external debt, by issuing external debt through a financial account surplus, because we have to attract hot money inflows, but that's debt itself, right? But, again, the evaluation is that even if you're attracting debt, but, not every debt is a problem, because if we have a small deficit, right? If we have a small deficit on the current account, guys, then it wouldn't be difficult to finance. Why? Because especially small deficits are not that difficult to finance, and we are not really concerned about small deficits, even if we are issuing external debt, because we actually consider the GDP growth rates. We actually see that if the GDP growth rates are higher, or if the growth in GDP, or the national income, or the real GDP, if that growth is actually increasing faster than the current account deficit. So okay, we have a current account deficit. We know that now we have to finance that deficit through debt, right? Because we'll actually finance the debt. So whatever the deficit is, whatever it is, let's say if it's a 3 million deficit, so we'll finance it through a debt of, let's say, $3 million. So you have a debt of $3 million, right? So, but if the GDP growth rate is rising faster than the amount of debt we will issue, or you can say if the GDP growth rate is rising faster than the amount of deficit we have, then we don't have to panic, right? Then even if the country is borrowing to finance the current account deficit, so there we don't have the risk of, the what do we call, the panic fueled, currency crisis that we thought would come, that can come. Usually the deficit is huge in the long term, so that won't happen, right? So so uh, so now we see that, the negative impacts on aggregate demand would not be significant if we have a small deficit, right? So if the thing is that if the government is actually looking for using expenditure, if the government is looking for using expenditure reducing policies, right? Okay, so if the government is kind of looking for expenditure reducing policies, um, then what is going to happen is that expenditure reducing policies, we know, or dampening policies would reduce AD, right? It would reduce the aggregate demand, and that would actually worsen the growth, right? And obviously, when growth worsens, unemployment would also rise, especially cyclical unemployment. It would have a recessionary impact. We'll move inside the PPC, creating inefficiency and a huge spare capacity, depending upon how much the AD has decreased, right? And the extent of the expenditure reducing policies as well. Now, these are all evaluations. The way look, just you need to focus on the way I'm saying, right? That is what matters, and that is what matters to the examiner as well, how you write it. So there's this unnecessary unemployment, because why are we calling it unnecessary unemployment? That you have This is unnecessary unemployment that the economy is generated. Why? Because the thing is that there was no need to generate this unnecessary unemployment, because we had a small deficit, and that deficit was, even if it was financed through borrowing, by creating external debt, it wasn't a problem, because the growth of GDP rate, the growth in the rate of GDP was faster than the amount of the deficit, right? So again, it wasn't a problem, and hence implementing expenditure reducing policies would represent government failure. This is the evaluation that you will make, that okay, fine, if you're implementing expenditure reducing policies resulting into subsequent unemployment, that is not a good thing if the deficit is small, because if you compare that small deficit with the higher rate of GDP growth, then it's not a problem. So creating this unemployment and reducing the GDP was kind of unnecessary, right? However, but the problem, the thing is that if the deficit is huge, or you can use different economic words, like if the deficit is ballooning, right? If the deficit is ballooning, if the deficit is huge, and if that deficit being huge is actually growing, that deficit is growing at a very faster rate than the increase in real GDP. So in that case, what is going to happen is, we know that if the deficit is huge, and even if the deficit is huge and that increase in deficit is quite is greater than the increase in the rate of GDP, or the the rate at which the GDP is growing. So that in that situation, financing that deficit through issuing external debt. Now listen to this very carefully. I repeat it. Financing that deficit by issuing external debt would not be sustainable. It's basically unsustainable thing that we finance the deficit by issuing external debt, because then it would just result into debt dependency. It would result into debt dependency, where you can say that the negative consequences of running a current account deficit would kind of become more significant now, because the amount of debt that you have borrowed is so huge, and plus the debt is quite less than sorry the debt is quite more than the amount of the GDP. Or you can Because you need to understand that it would actually also increase the debt to GDP ratio, right? So the debt to GDP ratio becomes higher. And why, in what circumstances the debt to GDP ratio would become higher? It would become higher when the amount of the deficit, or the amount of the debt that we have created, is quite less than the rate at which the GDP is growing, right? So we need to understand that all of this would actually be a total government failure. All of this, which means that if we have a huge deficit, a huge current account deficit, and we actually borrowed externally through financing it by raising the interest rates and allowing the money to flow in the economy as hot money inflows, and creating an equivalent financial account surplus. So we already, although we did finance the deficit, but then we created a lot of debt. And on the contrary, or on the GDP growth rate was also not that much. So again, that became a significant problem for us, and that created debt dependency. But why is this a problem? This problem is because the real problem was never identified. Why? Because, guys, the current account deficit was actually caused due to structural reasons. We agree that there are huge it's a huge current account deficit, but then it was actually caused by structural reasons. And what should have happened was, that is, there was lack of productivity, lack of there was poor investment, high inflation. Those were the reasons, lack of infrastructure, those were the reasons by which the structural deficit was caused, because that caused exports to actually fall, export revenues to go down. So if the structural deficit, if the deficit, guys, is caused by structural problems, I'll repeat it, if the deficit is caused by structural problems, that kind of deficit will be persistent and long term. Remember that the structural reasons need to be correct. If you don't correct the structural reasons, the current account deficit will keep on happening. It will be long term, use the word long term, and it will be persistent as well. So that is why it is very important for the government to actually be very focused, use targeted intervention policies, targeted and well considered policies, well implemented, well managed, well administrated, well considered policies, because then and only then it will be useful and it would be a success, right? So now this can form two good evaluations. It can also form the last two lines that I just said, can also form part of your conclusion as well. Remember that evaluations culminate or they end on conclusions and judgment paragraphs, right? So this is it for this video, guys. I hope you all enjoyed. I'll see you all around in the next video. Study hard, subscribe the channel, and do share the videos. Till then, take care.